Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance, ESG. This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, I interview Langston, Emerson, and Chris Brown from Mindset. Mindset is a bipartisan public policy firm based in Washington, D.C. Their clients range from household names in financial services to key change makers in energy, insurance, trade, technology, and beyond. Over the years, Mindset has become known for their deep expertise in financial services policy. Langston is a partner at Mindset and has a long track record of success in advancing business goals for clients with particular experience in private equity, venture capital, real estate, and insurance. He also leads the firm's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, both internally and externally. Chris is a principal at Mindset and has 15 plus years of experience in senior roles in the executive branch and the House of Representatives. Chris plays a critical role in Mindset's advocacy and advisory work across the firm. Hi, everyone. This is Emilie Nadler from KBRA's ESG team. I'm excited to be joined today by Langston Emerson and Chris Brown from the bipartisan public policy firm Mindset. Thank you both for coming on to talk about all of the ESG happenings in Washington, D.C. And so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the questions, if that's okay with both of you.
Sure.
So as you know, interest in ESG investing has greatly accelerated over the last 18 months. Has this focus on ESG by the financial community influenced conversations in Washington? And how have you really seen these conversations around ESG-related policy change over the last year or so?
Sure, I'll start. This is Chris, and thanks, Emily. Thanks for the opportunity to join you today. You know, at Mindset, we have seen a huge rise in the topic of ESG in the public policy circles, but also with financial market participants, which we represent a number of. Notably, there's been increased talk of ESG-focused regulation, especially from the SEC, which we can talk about in more detail later. And the president, President Biden has really pushed a lot of ESG topics to the forefront. And that's particularly true with respect to climate change mitigation and adaptation. In December 2020, because of the just amount of client interest in this and the growing interest in Washington, Mindset, our firm, started an email newsletter called ESG on the Mind that focuses on and categorizes all relevant ESG regulatory news, both in the U.S. and abroad. But I think it's safe to say that everything going on in Washington right now, ESG is at the forefront, and we see that, as I said, with financial market participants, but also with publicly traded firms across our platform and across the economy. More and more people really are turning a tremendous amount of attention to the topic.
Chris, that was great. This is Langston. I want to add one or two other points. I think that in addition to what the president and how he has been out front on ESG topics and his administrative agencies vis-a-vis the SEC has as well, on Capitol Hill, there have been a few committees of jurisdiction that have made an effort to include and incorporate ESG measures in all types of legislation. So we are starting to see this ESG metric or ESG interest and influence permeate through many different committees and many different types of legislation. So whether it passes and makes its way to the president's desk, it's somewhat irrelevant. It's more of the drumbeat that ESG is becoming increasingly more important. And we'll talk about that more later.
Yes, we're definitely hearing the drumbeat for sure. And as a subscriber of ESG on the Mind, I can say it's hugely helpful just to keep up with all of the ESG regulatory trends. So I would encourage people to sign up for that newsletter. So can you guys go kind of more into detail and talk about some of the ESG-focused legislation that has been passed so far this year?
Sure, absolutely. It's a lot of it, from my vantage point, really does focus on disclosure of publicly traded companies in particular. So we saw tremendous activity earlier this summer in the House Financial Services Committee. They passed a bill called the Corporate Governance Improvement and Investor Protection Act that took a number of ESG-related bills and combined them. That bill would require any issuer of securities to disclose to shareholders certain ESG metrics. the bill would also require public companies to disclose in their annual reports information related to financial and business risks associated with climate change, and for publicly traded firms to disclose greenhouse gas emissions and their fossil fuel related assets, among many other things. There are a number of other climate-related bills that are percolating in both the House and the Senate. As Langston mentioned, whether or not they make it through both chambers and to the White House for the president's signature remains unclear, but it's imperative that Congress be active and aggressive on this front. They are, if not legislating, in reality, at a minimum, setting the tone and trying to really push the administration and the private sector to be as aggressive on climate issues as humanly possible.
Thanks, Chris. I'd also note that there are a couple other pieces of the that ESG focused, but with a specific lens towards diversity and inclusion that have been incorporated into House legislative activity, and in the Senate, frankly. And the Improving Corporate Governance Through Diversity Act is a bill that passed the House last year, as well as in the Senate. There is a similar bill that they are looking to attach to a larger package of some sort. That bill would require public companies to disclose racial, ethnic, and gender compositions of their board of directors and executive officers and veteran status. It would also require covered companies to disclose any plan to promote diversity, and requires SEC to establish a diversity advisory group. There's also another bill that would amend the Dodd-Frank Act to mandate regulated entities disclose diversity data. This is, as you may be well aware, there is in Dodd-Frank voluntary effort to get entities that are regulated by the SEC to disclose diversity data. Congress wants to make that mandatory such that they have to report this data either on an annual or every couple of years. To some extent, they want to make sure that that data is being aggregated and reviewed and recorded at these companies of jurisdiction and sent over to the SEC. So that is a bill that was recently introduced. And again, it will likelihood of it making to the president's desk, not necessarily certain, but it also, again, adds pressure to these covered entities and corporate individuals and corporate companies and investors that Chris mentioned as well.
Yeah, Langston, I'm glad you mentioned the SEC, because obviously there's a lot of noise on Capitol Hill, but it is the administration and the regulators, particularly the financial regulators, that are really moving the needle and being even more aggressive and proactive probably than Congress. The president in May issued an executive order directing all federal agencies to analyze and mitigate their own climate-related exposure. And the premise of that really was to understand the risk and protect the U.S. financial system from climate risks. Secretary Yellen has also led on this. She announced in July that she is going to lead a regulatory review process to assess climate risk and the connection that climate risk has with financial stability. Just today, Treasury's Federal Insurance Office announced that it is launching a new effort on climate-related risks in the insurance sector. They're soliciting feedback and requesting comment on a number of climate-related priorities specific to that industry. And we're seeing that really across the board. For investors, the Department of Labor is expected to issue new rulemaking on ESG retirement investing and proxy voting, which also falls into the larger ESG bucket. And the Federal Reserve, of course, while a slower, more, I think, methodical body than the SEC, they're absolutely leading on this and have established a climate committee that's talking with banks and working with banks to determine what they're doing on climate risk, both as institutions internally, but also how they're viewing their book of business. And all of this, of course, is driving at hitting the goals that have been outlined in the Paris Accord. So there's a tremendous amount of activity, and a lot of that is really being done at the federal regulatory level. To the extent that it bears mentioning states are also getting involved. We have a number of states that have very aggressive financial services regulators that are closely looking at banking and insurance and securities, and the intersection that the state regulatory paradigm has with mitigating climate risk. I'll just flag that that's not true in every state, and there are actually other states that are moving in the opposite direction, particularly around kind of the social part of ESG. There are Republican legislatures and governors that are, for instance, prohibiting business deals with institutions, primarily banks at this point, that have taken on certain social mantles. So one example, there's a state that the legislature has moved to prohibit deals with banks that refuse to bank gun manufacturers, and those banks would no longer be considered for state contracts. So it's a little bit of a push and pull, but just important to bear in mind that the ESG regulatory regime is not only kind of born out of Congress, but it's really being driven a lot by the administration, and governors and state legislatures are getting involved as well.
Well, thank you both. That's really helpful. You touched on the SEC, and they've created the Sustainable Finance Advisory Committee. They've also have a new climate and ESG task force and created a new role, Senior Policy Advisor for Climate. So based on the comments made by people at the SEC, like Chairman Gary Gensler, Commissioner Hester Peirce, and Commissioner Allison Lee, how is the SEC thinking about ESG-related issues?
I think it's safe to say that the SEC today is somewhat divided. They're viewing ESG regulation as, to some degree, it's a bit of a partisan exercise. So you do have individuals like Commissioner Lee, who has strongly signaled support for the SEC's role in requiring companies to disclose ESG-related data. That's not just climate risk, but that's also information on political activity and on diversity and inclusion initiatives. Commissioner Peirce, on the other hand, has spoken and expressed, her serious opposition to ESG rulemakings, citing concerns around comparability, subjectivity of ESG data in addition to other issues that she has seen. But at the end of the day, the SEC is, it's controlled by Democrats and chaired by Gary Gensler, who is an incredibly adept, respected, and serious regulator. He has made it very clear that climate risk in particular is a top priority of his. And he's given several speeches and we've seen staff activity around climate risk reporting requirements. Most recently, that came through a speech that the chair gave where he outlined, maybe too strong of a word, but at least pointed to the 10K filing as an appropriate place to disclose climate risk. Langston has talked about the NASDAQ proposed rule, which the SEC recently approved. So by and large, the SEC has the flexibility and the capability to really be the tip of the spear on this. And they have the votes to approve things. So I think despite the fact that not all commissioners are aligned on ESG or ESG reporting requirements, that's where we're going to see a tremendous amount of activity later this year and into early next year.
I couldn't agree more, Chris. I think that in addition to the intense focus on climate disclosure within a kind of ESG framework, we do know that the SEC will also looking at corporate diversity and human capital management. And that includes, it's a broad umbrella, human capital management, under which a lot falls, which involves a lot around retention and inclusion, pay equity, and the like. So while it is clear that climate is very important to the chair, and it is something that he is moving forward on in no uncertain terms, it is also corporate diversity and human capital management. Diverse boards and the like are also of interest and are at the top of his list as well.
Got it. Definitely a lot of movement. So a place to watch for sure. I also want to touch on, the Senate also recently passed this huge $1 trillion infrastructure bill. And so though it hasn't been passed in the House yet and may face challenges there, what would this bill mean for climate mitigation and other ESG issues?
Great question. The bill as passed by the Senate includes $150 billion in funding for clean technology and other climate mitigation strategies. It includes billions of additional money in mitigation related to extreme weather, like flooding, sea level rise, wildfire. There's additional funding for electric vehicles and public transit systems. And again, all of this, really part of the larger effort to curb greenhouse gas emissions that in those instances come from the transportation sector across the country. There's additional funding for the Army Corps of Engineers for projects like flood control and river dredging, a lot of money for the U.S. Forest Service for land management and wildfire prevention. So, I could go on, but I think it's safe to say that senators, both Republicans and Democrats, believe that mitigation is really central to solving the U.S. climate crisis. And it's long overdue. And that is a point where there is some bipartisan consensus. Right. I run a group called the Smarter, Safer Coalition. It's a really interesting group of strange political bedfellows, everyone from insurance and reinsurance companies and trade associations to environmental groups and to taxpayer advocates. And that group was formed based purely on the notion that there are bipartisan solutions that can benefit communities in terms of pre-disaster mitigation, but also benefit taxpayers in terms of spending savings and benefit the environment. Every $1 that the U.S. government spends in mitigation saves $6 in post-disaster recovery efforts. So I think that really came through in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. You look at the state of the United States right now, we have wildfires raging throughout the western part of the country, significant damage from Hurricane Ida, and we're halfway through hurricane season, significant flooding in the state of Tennessee and elsewhere. And I think it's a unique opportunity to have Republicans and Democrats work together to find better solutions. Some of those solutions were included in that infrastructure bill.
Thank you for that. So the UN, as you both know, recently released a report on the effects of climate change, warning that the world will warm by 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2040. Do you think that the findings of this report will influence the conversations happening in Washington around climate mitigation?
They already have. The UN, the group, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was formed several years ago, is a bit of a divisive group on Capitol Hill, and Republicans have taken issue with the IPCC on previous work that the body has done. But look, at the end of the day, I don't think that matters. Democrats have closely read that report. It is part of the narrative, and it's really given yet another platform for climate awareness. So it is absolutely influencing conversations in Washington. Equally important, it's influencing conversations globally. And I think there are many people on both sides of the aisle that recognize that to really impact this conversation, you've got to have multilateral conversations. So having the UN voice add to that, though very concerning information, of course, but having their voice and having their expertise on the matter has generated a lot of activity and a lot of interest, both in the U.S. and abroad.
Great. And so I just have one last question for you both. So, looking ahead over the longer term, how do you think ESG-related policy will evolve over the next few years? And obviously, regulatory action will be hugely important, but are there other initiatives you think will be important to supplement regulatory policy? I know, Chris, you mentioned Smarter, Safer, so maybe you could go into a little bit more detail about that and any other organizations you think will be important.
Sure. I can start, and then Langston, maybe you can chime in. I think at the end of the day, maybe to talk first about just climate solution, it's going to take steps that withstand political change. It's going to take more buy-in from private industry and not just the financial sector, which really to date has been far more aggressive than other sectors in my estimation. So it's going to take kind of those strange bedfellow groups to add to the chorus and to make sure that regulators and legislators are continuing this effort. Right? It's going to take getting people like National Wildlife Federation and Natural Resources Defense Council together with insurance and reinsurance trade associations and taxpayer hawks like Taxpayers for Common Sense and the American Consumer Institute to come up with policies that withstand the test of political time. I think a lot of this depends on what happens in the upcoming elections. You know very well that the margins in both the House and the Senate are razor thin. And I think probably safe to say at this point that Republicans are poised to reclaim the majority in the House. That's going to disrupt any sort of ESG legislation. It will be incumbent upon the regulators in that instance to ensure that they are pressing forward. But I think as a Republican, it's important that they do so in a measured posture and with support from outside groups, because if you do something that's overtly political or viewed as being, terribly onerous on industry, it's easy to claw those things back. So I think the best way forward to me and how I see it playing out because of potential political changes are a slow and steady drumbeat of thoughtful policy that can shape the regulatory paradigm for the long term. Now, that's not to say that this administration is not going to be aggressive. And I would argue that if the House does flip next year, we will see an even more aggressive posture from the Biden administration because they know that they do not have kind of the full endorsement of Congress to move forward with things. So we may see very aggressive start here in the next 2 to 4 years from the regulators. But I think over time, these are things that are going to have to be influenced by stakeholders, not just stakeholders in the financial market, but environmental stakeholders, conservative stakeholders, and other industry participants.
I couldn't agree more, Chris. I think that you hit the nail on the head with the different stakeholders. I mean, looking beyond Congress regulatory or legislative activity, as well as the agency regulatory activity, there's an investor appetite to move forward. So, and press forward on ESG issues and to urge their companies that they invest in to do so. And we've seen that domestically and internationally. That's not necessarily going away. I think that there's also individuals. I mean, employees that work at these companies. We've seen letters, circulated from individual employees at firms that are making it known how they feel about issues that are related to ESG. So it's almost seemingly corporations are taking this incredibly important, and they're taking it seriously because they know it's very important, not just to the stakeholders, the third party or individual investors or institutional investors, but it's also very important to their employee base for a large part. So I think that the cat is out of the bag to a certain degree, whether we see more regulatory and legislative activity beyond the elections. And I agree with Chris wholeheartedly how that may shake out in the House, what that may mean for more activity in the ESG space making it to the president's desk. I think that the private sector has embraced some of this, not all, and is making steps and taking steps on behalf of the investors and their individual employees that have a vested interest in seeing some things change.
That is definitely true. I think at KBRA, we talk a lot about stakeholder pressure, and these stakeholders are really making their preferences on ESG issues known, and it's really driving a lot of the conversation. So it will be really interesting to see kind of how ESG evolves, because these issues are evolving so quickly, and also how regulation progresses both in the US and abroad around ESG issues. So I think that's all the questions we have time for today, but I want to thank you both so much for coming on and joining me to discuss all of the happenings in Washington today. It was really helpful.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you for having
me. This concludes our episode. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find the details of KBRA's ESG approach, our ESG research, podcasts, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG Weekly Roundup newsletter. New episodes of ESG Talks air every other week. In the meantime, please visit kbra.com to access our other podcast series, as well as our ratings and research.